Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Arabian Nights. In the chronicles of an ancient dynasty of the Sassanidae, who reigned for about 400 years, from Persia to the borders of China, beyond the great rivers of Ganges itself, we read the praises of one of the kings of its race, who was said to be the best monarch of his time. His subjects loved him, and his neighbors feared him, and when he died he left his kingdom in a more prosperous and powerful condition than any king had ever done before him. The two sons who survived him loved each other tenderly, and it was a real grief to the elder Shahryar that the laws of the empire forbade him to share his dominion with his brother Shahzaman. Indeed, after 10 years during which this state of things had not ceased to trouble him, Shahryar cut off the great country of Tartary from the Persian Empire and made his brother king. Now the Sultan Shahryar had a wife whom he loved more than all the world, and his greatest happiness was to surround her with splendor and to give her all the finest dresses and the most beautiful jewels. It was therefore with deepest shame and sorrow that he accidentally discovered, after several years, that she had deceived him completely, and her whole conduct turned out to have been so bad that he felt himself obliged to carry out the law of the land, and ordered the Grand Vizier to put her to death. The blow was so heavy that his mind almost gave way, and he declared that he was quite sure that at the bottom all women were as wicked as the Sultana, if you could only find them out, and the fewer the world contained, the better. So every evening he married a fresh wife and had her strangled the following morning before the Grand Vizier, whose duty it was to provide these unhappy brides for the Sultan. The poor man fulfilled his task with reluctance, but there was no escape, and every day saw a girl married and a wife dead. This behavior caused the greatest horror in the town, where nothing was heard but cries and lamentations. In one house was a father weeping for the loss of his daughter, in another, perhaps a mother trembling for the fate of her child, and instead of blessings that had formerly been heaped upon the Sultan's head, the air was now full of many curses. The Grand Vizier himself was the father of 2 daughters, of whom the eldest was called Scheherazade, and the younger Dinizarad. Dinizarad had no particular gifts to distinguish her from the other girls, but her sister was clever and courageous in the highest degree, and her father had given her to the best masters of philosophy, medicine, history, and the fine arts, and besides all this, her beauty excelled that of any girl in the kingdom of Persia. One day, when the Grand Vizier was talking with his eldest daughter, who was his delight and pride, Scheherazade said to him, "Father, I have a favor to ask of you. Will you grant it to me?" "I can refuse you nothing," he replied. "That is just and reasonable." "Then listen," said Scheherazade. "I am determined to stop this barbarous practice of the Sultan's, and to deliver the girls and mothers from this awful fate that hangs over them." "It would be an excellent thing to do," returned the Grand Vizier, "but how do you propose to accomplish it?" "My father," answered Scheherazade, "it is you who have provided the Sultan daily with a fresh wife, and I implore you, by all the affection you bear me, to allow that honor to fall upon me." "Have you lost your senses?" cried the Grand Vizier, starting back in horror. "What has put such a thing into your head? You ought to know by this time what it means to be the Sultan's bride." "Yes, my father, I know it well," she replied, "and I am not afraid to think of it. If I fail, my death will be a glorious one, and if I succeed, I shall have done a great service to my country. It is of no use, I shall not consent. If the Sultan was to order me to plunge a dagger into your heart, I would have to obey. What a task for a father! Ah, if you do not fear death, fear at any rate the anguish you would cause me." "Once again, my father," said Scheherazade, "will you grant me what I ask? Why are you so obstinate? exclaimed the Grand Vizier. "Why are you so resolved upon your own ruin?" But the maiden absolutely refused to attend her father's words, and at length, in despair, the Grand Vizier was obliged to give way, and went sadly to the palace to tell the Sultan that the following evening he would bring him Scheherazade. The Sultan received this news with the greatest astonishment. "How have you made up your mind," he asked, "to sacrifice your own daughter to me?" "Sire," answered the Grand Vizier, "it is her own wish. Even the sad fate that awaits her could not hold her back." "Let there be no mistake, Vizier," said the Sultan. "Remember, you will have to take her life yourself. If you refuse, I swear your head shall pay the forfeit." "Sire," returned the Vizier, "whatever the cost, I will obey you. Though a father, I am also your subject." So the Sultan told the Grand Vizier he might bring his daughter as soon as he liked. The Vizier took back the news to Scheherazade, who received it as if it had been the most pleasant thing in the world. She thanked her father warmly for yielding to her wishes, and seeing him still bowed with grief, told him that she hoped he would never repent having allowed her to marry the Sultan. Then she went to prepare herself for marriage, and begging her sister Dezinerad should be sent for her to speak to her. When they were alone, Scheherazade addressed her thus: "My dear sister, I want your help in a very important affair. My father is going to take me to the palace to celebrate my marriage with the Sultan. When His Highness receives me, I shall beg him as a last favor to let you sleep in our chamber, so that I may have your company during the last night I am alive. If, as I hope, he grants me my wish, be sure that you wake me an hour before the dawn, and speak to me in these words: 'My sister, if you are not asleep, I beg you, before the sun rises, to tell me one of your charming stories.' Then I shall begin, and I hope by our means to deliver the people from the terror that reigns over them." Dezinerad replied that she would do with pleasure what her sister wished. When the usual hour arrived, the Grand Vizier conducted Scheherazade to the palace and left her alone with the Sultan, who bade her raise her veil, and was amazed at her beauty. But seeing her eyes full of tears, he asked what was the matter.
"Sire," replied Scheherazade, "I have a sister who loves me as tenderly as I love her. Grant me the favor of allowing her to sleep this night in the same room, as it is the last we shall be together." Shahryar consented to Scheherazade's petition, and Dezinerad was sent for. An hour before daybreak, Dezinerad awoke and exclaimed as she had promised, "My dear sister, if you are not asleep, tell me before the sun rises one of your charming stories. It is the last time that I shall have the pleasure of hearing you." Scheherazade did not answer her sister, but turned to the Sultan. "Will your Highness permit me to do as my sister asks?" she said. "Willingly," he answered. So Scheherazade began. The Story of the Merchant and the Genius. Sire, there was once upon a time a merchant who possessed great wealth in land and merchandise, as well as in ready money. He was obliged from time to time to take journeys to arrange his affairs. One day, having to go a long way from home, he mounted his horse, taking with him a small wallet in which he had a few biscuits and dates, because he had to pass through the desert where no food was to be got. He arrived without mishap, and having finished his business, he set out on his return. On the 4th day of his journey, the heat of the sun being very great, he turned out of his road to rest under some trees. He found at the foot of a large walnut tree a clear and running water. He dismounted, fastened his horse to a branch of the tree, and sat by the fountain, after having taken from his wallet some dates and biscuits. When he had finished his frugal meal, he washed his face and hands in the fountain. When he was thus employed, he saw an enormous genius, white with rage, coming towards him with a large scimitar in his hand. "Arise," he cried in a terrible voice, "and let me kill you as you have killed my son." As he uttered these words, he gave a frightful yell. The merchant, quite as much terrified at the hideous face of the monster as at his words, answered him tremblingly, "Alas, good sir, what have I done to you to deserve death?" "I shall kill you," repeated the genius, "as you have killed my son."
"But," said the merchant, "how can I have killed your son? I do not know him, and I have never seen him." "When you arrived here, did you not sit on the ground?" said the genius. "And did you not take some dates from your wallet? And whilst you were eating them, did you not throw the stones about?" "Yes," said the merchant, "I certainly did so." "Then," said the genius, "I tell you, you have killed my son, for whilst thou wert throwing about the stones, my son passed by, and one of them struck him in the eye and killed him. So I shall kill you." "Ah, sir, forgive me," cried the merchant. "I will have no mercy on you," answered the genius. "But I killed your son quite unintentionally, so I implore you, spare my life." "No," said the genius, "I shall kill you as you killed my son." And so saying, he seized the merchant by the arm, threw him to the ground, and lifted his saber to cut off his head. The merchant, protesting his innocence, bewailed his wife and children and tried pitifully to avert his fate. The genius, with his raised scimitar, waited until he had finished, but was not in the least touched. Scheherazade, at this point, seeing it was day, and knowing that the Sultan always rose very early to attend council, stopped speaking. "Indeed, sister," said Dinarzade, "this is a wonderful story." "The rest is still more wonderful," replied Scheherazade, "and you would say so, if the Sultan would allow me to live another day, and would give me leave to tell it to you the next night." Shahryar, who had been listening to Scheherazade with pleasure, said to himself, "I will wait till tomorrow. I can always have her killed when I have heard the end of her story." All this time, the Grand Vizir was in a terrible state of anxiety, but he was much delighted when he saw the Sultan enter the council chamber without giving the terrible command that he was expecting. The next morning, before the day broke, Dinarzade said to her sister, "Dear sister, if you are awake, I pray you to go on with your story." The Sultan did not wait for Scheherazade to ask his leave. "Finish," he said, "the story of the genius and the merchant. I am curious to hear the end." So Scheherazade went on with the story. This happened every morning. The Sultana told the story, and the Sultan let her live to finish it. When the merchant saw that the genius was determined to cut off his head, he said, "One word more, I entreat you. Grant me a little delay, just a short time to go home and bid my wife and children farewell, and to make my will. When I have done this, I will come back here, and you shall kill me." "But," said the genius, "if I grant you the delay you ask, I am afraid you will not come back." "I give you my word of honor," answered the merchant, "and I will come back without fail." "How long will you require?" asked the genius. "I ask you for a year's grace," replied the merchant. "I promise you that tomorrow 12th I shall be waiting under these trees to give myself up to you." On this the genius left him near the fountain and disappeared. The merchant, having recovered from his fright, mounted his horse and went on his road. When he arrived home, his wife and children received him with the greatest joy. Instead of embracing them, he began to weep so bitterly that they soon guessed that there was something terrible. Then he told them what had passed between him and the genius, and how he had given his word to return at the end of a year to be killed. When they heard this sad news, they were in despair and wept much. The next day, the merchant began to settle his affairs, and first of all to pay his debts. He gave presents to his friends and large alms to the poor. He set his slaves at liberty and provided for his wife and children. The year soon passed away, and he was obliged to depart. When he tried to say goodbye, he was quite overcome with grief, and with difficulty tore himself away. At length he reached the place where he had first seen the genius on that very day that he had appointed. He dismounted and sat down at the edge of the fountain, where he awaited the genius in terrible suspense. While he was thus waiting, an old man leading a hind came towards him. They greeted one another, and the old man said to him, "May I ask, brother, what brought you to this desert place where there are so many evil genii about? To see these beautiful trees, one would imagine it was inhabited, but it is a dangerous place to stop long in. The merchant told the old man why he was obliged to come here. He listened in astonishment. "This is the most marvelous affair. I should like to be a witness of your interview with the genius." So saying, he sat down by the merchant. While they were talking, another old man came up, followed by 2 black dogs. He greeted them and asked what they were doing in this place. The old man who was leading the hind told him the adventures of the merchant and the genius. The second old man had not sooner heard the story than he, too, decided to stay there to see what would happen. He sat down by the others and was talking when a third old man arrived. He asked why the merchant who was with them looked so sad. They told him the story, and he was resolved to see what would pass between the genius and the merchant, so waited with the rest. They soon saw in the distance a thick smoke, like a cloud of dust. The smoke came nearer and nearer, then all at once it vanished, and they saw the genius, who, without speaking to them, approached the merchant sword in hand, and taking him by the arm, said, "Get up, and let me kill you as you killed my son." The merchant and the 3 old men began to weep and groan. Then the old man, leading the hind, threw himself at the monster's feet and said, "O Prince of the Genii, I beg you to stay your fury and listen to me. I am going to tell you my story and that of the hind that I have with me, and if you find it more marvelous than that of the merchant whom you are about to kill, I hope that you will do away with the third part of his punishment." The genius considered some time, and then he said, "Very well, I agree to this."